And now to Elizabeth Brackett and the budget battle raging in Washington. Elizabeth.
Thanks, Phil. Well, President Barack Obama says his 2012 budget will cut the deficit in half by the end of his first term. But neither Democrats nor Republicans are cheering. Republican House Speaker John Boehner lambasted the president's nearly $4 trillion budget, saying the budget proposes spending too much, taxing too much, and borrowing too much. Even Democrats have questioned why Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid were left off the table. Now here to help us with some answers are Edward Stewart, a professor of economics at Northeastern Illinois University, and John Nothdurft of the Heartland Institute Center on Taxes and the Economy. Thank you both, gentlemen, for coming in.
Good evening.
Well, as I said, that $3.73 trillion budget will cut the deficit in half. It will cut by $1.1 trillion over the next 10 years. That sounds like a good idea, right, John Nothdurft?
It would be if it was actually going to cut any long-term debt, but unfortunately, his proposal is going to add $8 trillion over a 10-year span and add $1.5 trillion in taxes over the same span. So really,
add to the deficit or to the
national
budget?
debt.
To the national debt.
Right, and that's really what we're talking about. Yeah, you can cut a deficit, but they're still leaving a deficit, which means we're spending more than we're taking in.
What do you say to that?
Well, as I talked to the producers before this, I don't even have an idea that the deficit is a problem. Right now, the problem is unemployment, lack of economic growth, poverty, inequality. We have real serious problems in the United States, and the deficit is not one of them. We have a downturn in the economy that started in '08, and private spending has decreased substantially, and government spending actually hasn't increased enough to get economic activity back to a robust level and the unemployment rate down to a moderately acceptable level of, say, 5%, which it was throughout the latter part of the 1990s and even some of the 2000s.
Well, that's certainly a wide difference of opinion here between the two of you. So you say there shouldn't be cuts.
No, this is the exact wrong time for the government, any government, state governments which have been cutting. And that's one of the problems, one of the reasons the recession has stayed so severe is that city and state governments are forced to cut spending when their revenues decline. The only actor in the economy that can balance declines in local government spending, in private sector spending, both by households and businesses, is the federal government. And frankly, it hasn't been doing enough spending in '09 and 10 to get the economy moving again.
John Nothdurft, the deficit is not a problem?
It is a problem, and if government spending was what made our economy go, well, our entire budget has doubled since 2001, so we should be booming, but we're not, and we're in a huge recession. We're going to see more deficit spending, and we haven't seen any real growth from that, and now he wants to raise taxes on where the jobs should be coming from, the private sector.
Well, let's talk about what actually is in the budget. There are cuts, and they're all actually, Obama says he would freeze all domestic non-defense discretionary spending for the next 5 years. That means some real cuts in community development block grants, in community action funds, in funds for low-income residents who need help with their heating bills. The Great Lakes Restoration Project, which affects us, would be cut by 25%. Now, when you look at the fact that 20% of the world's fresh water is located in the Great Lakes, you're talking about some significant cuts.
And the Environmental Protection Agency is set for cuts.
Right.
I mean, if you look at what's not being cut, defense spending, which is in 2012 projected to be near $600 billion, and the EPA is being cut from $10 billion to $9 billion. It's madness that we have serious environmental concerns. We have water quality concerns. We have air quality concerns. And we're cutting spending for the Environmental Protection Agency. There are also cuts for the Center for Disease Control, which is it's madness in the face of the kinds of problems we have, just so that we can continue defense spending and tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans who in the last 20 years have seen their incomes rise exponentially while most Americans have had no increase in their real incomes.
So you say you really don't want to see any cuts, but would you, what about in defense spending, for instance?
I'd cut defense spending and transfer it to domestic spending, and the real deficit reduction that could have happened would have taken place in January when the Republicans and the Democrats cut a tax deal that kept the Bush tax giveaways to the ultra-rich in the budget, that those taxes should have gone up at least to the Clinton levels. I sometimes joke in my classes that it would be nice to have the top marginal bracket go back to the Eisenhower levels, but I'd settle for 39% before we get to 90%.
Somehow, I think you're going to disagree with that.
Well, partly. Part of the great I do agree with, defense spending definitely needs to be on the table. Defense spending and entitlements combined make up 2/3 of federal spending. Those both have to be on the table. You cannot get serious about cutting the deficit or the national debt without cutting defense spending and entitlements. You just can't do it.
And even there's the independent budget commission, the deficit commission report, that did recommend going after entitlements. That is sort of the elephant in the room in this budget. Proposal from the president that he doesn't talk about entitlements. So can you have any kind of meaningful cuts without talking about entitlements?
Well, here we have some agreement with John, because in my classes I say there's really, if you're serious about the federal government, you have to look at the 3 places where the real money is. One is the interest on the federal debt, which can't be touched because that's a legal obligation, and the other 2 are Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, the non-defense, and then defense and security. The rest of it is, I mean, yes, as Everett McKinley Dirksen used to say, $1 million here and $1 million there, and you're talking about real money. But in terms of
$1 billion here and $1 billion there
now we've got it a little bit bigger. But in terms of the overall budget and its share of the economy, then the rest of the things, like you were talking about, the block grants, the Labor Department, transportation, education, those are very, very small numbers, and there's not much to cut there. That'll make a difference.
They're cutting in the wrong place.
They're cutting in politically acceptable places and not touching Social Security and defense spending.
Well, perhaps the president, by not talking about those things, now the Republicans are talking about them, saying that they must be on the table, that everything must be on the table, including the entitlements. So was that perhaps a fairly clever political move of the president to get the discussion on the table on those entitlements?
It may have been, but if that you're just lining up for the Republicans to either, prove to the people who got them into office and gave them sweeping a good majority in the House to say, are you serious about cutting spending? Because if you are, you will start giving serious thoughts about cutting entitlements and defense. If they don't, and they want to, be careful about the political ramifications, then they really didn't. They're just going to be Republicans of old. So can you? Why is it just always the third rail to even talk about Social Security? Social Security, which does not impact the deficit, correct?
Oh no, it does. I mean, it's the biggest outlay in the federal budget. It's now even bigger than defense spending if you talk about Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Those 3.
But I've heard all day that it doesn't actually impact the deficit.
Yeah,
because the Social Security funds are separate funds.
Well, but they all go into the Fed. There's a combined budget. There's what they call a unified budget, which is what we're talking about. And Social Security is the largest single outlay item. Defense spending is fairly close to that, but yeah, that's a serious issue. And the reason it's not touched, I mean, I'm just a simple economist. I'm not a political scientist or a psychologist, but one of the things that I tell my students who are relatively young is that young people in America don't vote and old people do, and most of Social Security benefits go to middle income or upper middle income individuals, and those are fairly active voters with a high voter participation.
So how do you think Social Security should be cut when you're talking about?
I don't think it should be cut. I don't think it should be cut at all. I think it's pretty minimal as it is. I mean, in international comparisons, we do very, very small.
So you don't think it should be cut? You think military spending should be cut?
Right.
How do you think Social Security should be cut? Raising the retirement age or what?
You have to do all of the above. You have to start looking. I mean, people are living longer, retiring earlier, and collecting for a lot longer. So you have to fundamentally change how Social Security operates. I mean, you can talk about maybe individual accounts going to defined contribution versus defined benefit. Raising the retirement age is one way. Doing a tiered system based on income. I mean, you can do a lot of different things, but there has to be some cuts in Social Security, or basically saying we cannot sustain this sort of spending for these programs.
We are coming up against a deadline in terms of the federal debt ceiling, which is we're going to hit it probably sometime between April and May.
Right.
And if the ceiling is not raised, then the country actually could go into default.
Right. That's
Does
one of
that
those,
ceiling have to be raised?
Yeah, and it's one of those silly issues that, there shouldn't be a debt ceiling, right? Because that's not an important number. It's not an important. There is, yes, but it's there for politics. And as an economist, I have to say that it's an irrelevant number. It's an irrelevant decision.
Except it could lead to a government shutdown.
Yes, because it's there, it could. But in terms of economics, there's no magic number about the debt shouldn't be this level or that level. It depends on the nature of the business cycle. It depends on the size of the economy. And as the economy grows, it can tolerate higher and higher levels of gross federal debt.
John Nothdurft, do you see a government shutdown as a possibility?
No, I don't see that probably happening. But at the same time, we should have a balanced budget. So, I mean, why can't we have a ceiling of debt? I mean, there should be something that says you cannot get into any more debt. I mean, there has to be some sort of stopping, either whether it be spending spending limitations, require a balanced budget at the federal level, something so you can restrain this sort of out-of-control government spending that's gotten us into this mess.
You know, there's also the budget. We're talking about 2012, but there's also this year's budget. 7 more months left of this year's budget. There's a continuing resolution that runs out in March 4th. And again, the possibility of a government shutdown. And the House Republicans have some major spending cuts outlined in this budget. Will it be enough? One of them, dear to our hearts, is zeroing out funding for public broadcasting. Right. So are these kinds of cuts actually going to pass?
Let's hope not. Let's hope that the Senate has enough political courage and intelligence to put a stop to this kind of imbecility that goes on and masquerades as serious economic proposal.
What do you think, John?
I think you have to have all spending on the table. We need to relook at all spending.
For this year and 2012.
Yes. I mean, this year spending is 7% over what it was last year. So we're still spending more. So obviously it's not a revenue problem. It's a spending problem.
All right. We'll have to leave it there, gentlemen. And my many thanks to Edward Stewart and John Nothdurft.